Choosing the right setting for a video game may appear to be a simple task. However, the more I think about it and the harder the task becomes. To set a game in a specific time and place can make or break an experience, and the game setting could be the deciding factor whether or not to purchase a given title, therefore being an important aspect to consider when analyzing a game. But why? First things first, roll the intro. Every video game has a defined setting, sometimes a precise moment in history, sometimes an imagined fantasy world, and at times even unthinkable surreal universes. The care that developers put in the settings is different from title to title. More often than not, we have games set in generic modern cities, think on games like Saints Row for instance, but some games are indeed set in complex and dynamic ecosystems, crafted to the millimeter. But we're not here to state the obvious and say something like the more developers put in the world building the better, but rather to analyze how choosing a specific setting can have an impact on the game despite its quality. In other words, the right setting works for the right game, and different settings can make a game more or less appealing. Think about games like Watch Dogs 1 and 2 for instance. The grey metropolis of Chicago goes hand in hand with the more opaque tone of the plot of the first game, while the vivid and colorful San Francisco reflects the more chill attitude of its sequel's plot. The simple distinction between setting can not only tell us much more about a game, but a setting can work as a very effective link between story and gameplay, bridging the two in a more effective way without disrupting them at an individual point. The wrong setting can ruin a game by simply making the game feel wrong, without actually changing other characteristics. Do not get me wrong, if a game is fun to play, the setting will have less of an impact for the player's experience, gameplay-wise. However, this does not diminish the importance the settings has in the gaming experience as a whole. Choosing the right setting can make two similar games feel different even when the differences between the two are minimal. In today's video, I wish to bring some examples to reinforce my thesis on why settings are important in the gaming world, discussing the topic more broadly to then make some very specific comparison and contrast with my favorite games, how two very similar titles can have a very different feeling when playing them due to this factor, how settings are much more important than you might initially think. Have you ever heard the expression that game is like Skyrim but in space, or it's just like GTA but set elsewhere? These comparisons are useful to quickly explain a game's structure without going too much into detail, and I use them myself. However, they are too often simplistic and miss the importance settings can have in structuring a game. The game setting tells you a lot about a game, more than you might initially think. Let us kick off immediately with an easy example, The Elder Scrolls and Fallout. Yes, both are Bethesda branded games, have that Bethesda RPG style and even run on the same not so high quality Bethesda engine, but the differences in settings play a crucial role in distinguishing the titles. The difference between the post-apocalyptic and the medieval fantasy scenarios appear to be contrasting, however mechanically the difference between the two series is not critical. Weapons in Fallout New Vegas and magic in Skyrim have virtually the same usage, not to mention that both worlds are ruled by factions, have small settlements and are filled with quests to complete and ignore, yet the fanbase for both games does not always align. The Elder Scrolls and the Fallout franchise and soon to be released Starfield have all different philosophies behind the games due to their different locations, even if structurally they all work similarly. In Skyrim you're an adventurer, in Fallout a survivor, two very different moods of the surface, yes, but in practice have very effectively the same way to play, gather everything you find and get stronger. Take a game, any game of your choice, and imagine it being set in a completely different setting and time frame. Would you play Zelda if it was set in a steampunk world? What about playing Nier in a prehistoric period? A fantasy Half-Life? Or what about GTA but set in Paris? Sounds like a cool idea for spin-offs, but deep down you know that those games would have a different vibe, a different way to interpret the same gameplay because of the setting. And while these may sound as exaggerated examples, there are two games that I love that are identical, and I mean identical in gameplay but have drastically different settings. I'm talking about Advance Wars and Wargroove, two turn-based strategy games that share it all, but the location. As you can see from the video in the background, Advance Wars is a game set in modern times, with weapons and vehicles similar to the Second World War. More specifically, the Orange Army are the Americans, Blue Moon the Soviets, Green Earth the Germans and Gold Comet the Japanese. The remakes more specifically had these toy-looking models to make the game's war themes slightly toned down. Wargroove on the other hand has this very clear medieval fantasy style, similar to a game like The Witcher but pixel style. There are swordmen, knights and catapults, even some magic put into the mix. While the different factions have different creatures from the undead to the plant-based life forms, the units are interchangeable and only change aesthetically, just like in Advance Wars. If you pay close attention to both games, you will notice quite quickly that the gameplay is extremely similar, having many units mimicking each other's functionality even if dressed differently. Like sure, in one game mechs cost 300 pounds and in the other the spearman costs 250 gold, but you get the gist. There are some gameplay differences, mainly how generals work, bonuses and gasoline, but to be honest, you will be forgiven if you hardly notice the difference in gameplay between these 4 corners and these 4 corners. I mean, come on, they are the same game. However, both play have a different feeling, a different vibe that makes me appreciate Advance Wars more than Wargroove. But why? The settings of the games are very different, and even if mechanically speaking units act the same, the feeling of using artillery and using a trebuchet is simply different. You could ask me why, but to be honest there is no real reason. I cannot explain why it feels more right to use a bomber than a dragon. Wargroove here has no fault, and I still love the game and I'm looking forward for the sequel, but it doesn't click me in the same way as Advance Wars does. Suddenly the comparison, the game is like that but in this way, are true, but do not necessarily mean the level of appreciation is the same. A game like Just Cause 4 has the same gameplay and even some improvements over Just Cause 3, but the Mediterranean setting of the latter game enchants me more, and not just because I'm Italian. Okay, maybe I do have some bias, but that's exactly the point. Biases towards a preferential setting can influence the enjoyment a player has over a game. The choice of the time and location a game takes place in is not arbitrary, nor should it be ignored when evaluating the game as a whole. I do find more enjoyable the World War II aesthetics of Advance Wars over the fantasy one of Wargroove, even if both are filled with personality and have virtually the same gameplay. And we could cite more examples just to bring this point home. Games like Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and Lies of P will have different audiences even if the mechanics of the two games do not deviate that much. Bioshock Infinite and Atomic Heart have been compared, the latter being nicknamed Soviet Bioshock, but the difference in setting greatly affects the plot and hence the playability of both first-person shooters. Of course, quality-wise any game can work in any setting, as long as the game works well, but personal taste always plays a role. Even if I recognize a game like Far Cry 4 to be very derivative of the previous title, I cannot help the fact that the Himalayan location is much more appealing to me than the jungle FC3 was set in, and do not get me started on Far Cry Blood Dragon. And sometimes it is not just personal opinion regarding gameplay. Sometimes settings have to be chosen carefully for the right story. A game like Yakuza 0, prequel of the franchise, really makes usage of the Japanese economic miracles that were the 80s to the fullest in order to explain Kiryu's and Majima's origin stories. Both protagonists are relatively young, inserted in a world full of opportunities but also corruption and uncertainty, infinite wealth that makes everyone poorer. Settings are a good save to justify story and gameplay choices from the developers without the need to artificially have them justified by other means. Take Pokemon Legend Arceus for instance. While I find it annoying that the game has only but empty lands, the pre-industrial setting does make them slightly more digestible, even if they are filled with other gameplay problems. To make an opposite example for a good game with a quote-unquote wrong setting for me is Wolfenstein The New Order. Look, I get it, I also like alternative history, but what is the point of making a game so futuristic but setting it canonically in the 1960s? Fallout is futuristic with atomic punk aesthetics, but the game is still set in the far future. Here there's really no excuse. It doesn't make the game less enjoyable by any means, but it always bugged me and left me an annoying feeling. Point being that a setting in a video game is much more than a simple background, a simple incipit that kickstarts an adventure for the sake of having it somewhere unique. Settings can and have an influence on how players combine plot and gameplay, sometimes enhancing or penalizing the same gaming experience. Choosing the right setting is not a secondary task, an afterthought that goes unnoticed to the player, but rather an important element that, while not affecting the quality of a game directly, can affect the audience it brings to itself. We've seen how different franchises and different games with similar mechanics can have greater or weaker appeal just for the setting, regardless of what the game actually plays. After today's reflection, I hope I made you think about the settings of the games you most enjoy playing, and maybe you do notice a pattern or two previously hidden between your gaming library. Maybe you didn't buy a game not for its quality, gameplay or story, but simply because it is quote-unquote not in the setting I like. If you made it this far, I wanted to thank you one too many settings times for watching today's video. I was planning to make a longer discussion, but to be honest, I've noticed that I was just repeating the same point over and over, and that's made it a bit shorter. But do let me know if you want another video about settings with another dilemma to solve. Anyways, as usual, I invite you to leave this video a like, to share it and to subscribe for more. I wish you a wonderful day, and until next time, arrivederci.